districts and what they're doing and how that should be standardized, if at all. The second thing that we want them to look into is the process of transferring back to traditional schools from alternative schools, and if that should actually be a positive outcome that is pushed. Given our outcome data that you saw with students who switched back and forth, a lot of the gains that are made at alternative schools are lost when the student switches back to traditional schools. And so, in thinking about the fact that alternative schools serve students who have needs that aren't being met in traditional schools, we should also think about if they should be tasked to remediating those needs, or if simply they should be tasked to meeting those needs. And we think that there's a really, there's an interesting tension there, and maybe there's a question that needs to be answered in actually defining the purpose of alternative schools themselves before we actually look at that switch that's happening. And now we're ready for any questions that you may have.
I have a question.
Yeah,
We're
Greg.
supposed to go first according to you, Joe.
Yeah.
At the start, you were very careful to say this is context specific and sort of not externally valid, or you're not sure. I'm not sure I understand why you couldn't say these are great guidelines for other districts or not. Why were you so careful to say that?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, every school district is different in California. There are hundreds of school districts in the state. Some are urban and have higher English language learner populations, like San Jose, for example. Some are rural districts and have extreme teacher shortages. There's just a plethora of needs, and also the referral process is different for alternative students in different districts. The definition of these terms like credits and credit deficiency and graduation rates are all district specific. So I think that we just wanted to be clear that while the state board agreed that a lot of these recommendations could be applied to other districts, that this is particular to San Jose. Also, how alternative schools are even classified in different districts is different. So most things are different.
So you said your research was in parallel with the Gardner Center.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Did they use similar methodology? Did they come to similar conclusions? What do you know about what they did relative to what you did?
Most of our discussion with the Gardner Center was I think one of the biggest things that we worked in parallel with them on was the idea of the save rate. That was something that they've talked about really wanting to focus in on and looking, because the districts that they're working with are also very large. So they're gonna, being able to conduct similar research in those districts is gonna help hopefully substantiate some of the things that we found in San Jose. But beyond talking about kind of the nature of kind of our structure of what we wanted to look at, and especially introducing the idea of the save rate, there was not data sharing and any of that. So most of our discussion was more at the kind of conceptual level rather than looking at specific methodology and outcomes.
And just thinking in usefulness for our client, it's probably good for them to have two relatively independent entities making recommendations on that. So we haven't conferred on findings yet. We know they've presented to the state board, and they have a working group on alternative schools, and then before the end of the year, we'll definitely
Are you going to talk to them and convey your?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think they are actually, not to toot our own horn, but they are delayed. They have many projects, so they are actually, they haven't presented their final recommendations to the state board yet. They, in February, presented on the student demographic data, but haven't gotten to the recommendations.
Yes.
So, I mean, on the face of it, your recommendations make sense to me, but I'm wondering if you had any, in the report perhaps, if you had any more explicit definition of what the desirable properties of the good indicators are. For example, you mentioned in the slides fairness and accuracy, but what does fairness mean? And what should good indicators, what should the properties be? Should they be measuring progress, or should they be measuring level, or, I mean, there's a variety of questions like that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think our first response, and we alluded to this at the end, is that there is an unclear mission statement for alternative schools at the state level. So I think to most appropriately answer that question, it would depend on, the state board needs to come together and define a mission for alternative schools, because like we're saying, we're not sure if it's, some people expressed it was high school graduation rate, some people expressed that it was to successfully transfer them back to their traditional school, and those would have two different implications for what indicators should be, right? So we can't define what the purpose of alternative schools is, but in our final report, we did recommend that they sit down and talk about that. But so we would imagine that these indicators plug into the accountability system that is already used for schools in California, which measures both status and growth. So on each of these indicators, there is a status or a level that a school would be meeting, and then there's also a growth indicator from the previous year. And then it's a 5x5 matrix of different levels of growth and status, and then that overall matrix determines the overall ranking of that school, or the overall score. So it does take into account both status and growth. And then to address your question about fair and accurate, that's what we were really trying to do with our work, is to figure out what are the key stakeholders in the district, at the school, the students themselves defining as success, and then how could we craft indicators that best represent the success that's articulated by the state board, the district, students, teachers, etc.
I was curious about the population that you talked about that moves from the alternative schools back to the traditional. How large is that population? And you kind of alluded to it just now by saying, oh, it might be the goal that alternative students are transitioning back to traditional schools, but I was just curious about that population and how big is it?
It's about 30% of an alternative school at a given time. So in San Jose, the numbers are kind of wonky because they've changed their structure a lot over the years. They used to have continuation schools, and so their alternative school population used to be much larger. So now, yeah, they used to have community schools that were situated within the high schools themselves. Given that alternative schools probably serve around 400 students right now, about 100 students will move back in a given year. But also, it's a little difficult to measure because sometimes they're entering right at 12th grade, so they wouldn't be moving back. They wouldn't have the opportunity to move back.
First of all, well done. Thanks. Really interesting. I was wondering on your non-academic behaviorism, suspension and absenteeism. I was wondering if you had considered any of the indicators that would let you get at actual mechanisms, so around belonging, or around like I feel like there's an adult in the school who cares about me, or these kinds of things that like give some answers to what lies underneath in the mechanisms.
I can start that one of the things we did find in our qualitative research when we had the opportunity to speak with teachers and students in the school, that was one thing that actually was qualitative that they said is, one student in particular that we spoke to said feeling very alienated in the traditional school, feeling like it was very difficult to access teachers and to when she had questions to get them answered, when she needed help finding time, and then coming to an alternative system that was very personalized, where all of her in-school interaction was one-on-one with a teacher. And so that was something that I know for me at least, we weren't totally sure how to incorporate that, given that there also are a lot of different structures of alternative schools and programs, but I think would definitely be worth considering, since the flexibility and accommodation is something that's so important, and I think a lot of alternative schools really strive to provide for their students.
And we did, that is in our report, when we presented to the state board, we shared with them that it's clear that in the alternative school setting, they feel real ownership over those students. At Broadway High School, the principal conducts home visits for all of the students who are entering in his school the next year, and they really pride themselves on having that really close relationship. And so one of the things we talked about in seeing that kind of, surprising trend of students losing that progress when they transfer back to a traditional school is saying, okay, we need to get clear on what the purpose of these schools are, and look, it's a possibility that there's a need being met in terms of those feelings of belonging and becoming at alternative schools that they're not getting at traditional schools.
I think the next we teach traditional schools.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Probably one or two more questions. Any other questions?
Yeah, oh, this is really cool, thank you so much. I wanna to ask if you could talk a bit more about how you, I guess, collected data. I guess you talked about several different individuals who you spoke with, but, yeah, who were the people you were speaking to? How did you choose to speak to them? Was there some self-selection there?
So the interviews themselves were, so first we had our initial client meeting, and then we were introduced with district staff at San Jose Unified. So we talked to the person, Dane, who oversees all of the alternative education, started with him and asked him to give us his narrative. We then looked at the staff member who managed the actual switch itself, and talked to her, and then from there we were connected with alternative school educators. So there are only two kind of principals to speak to. So we had a meeting where it's a little nerve-wracking because they're like, we're looking to hold your schools accountable. And they're like, okay, we guess you will help with this endeavor. So we spoke with the two principals. We did site visits, and then the principals recommended to us who we should talk to, and then we kind of just spent some time walking around the schools, and we spoke with a teacher, a few teachers and some students, and so it kind of just filtered down from the top, and we just wanted to make sure, especially as we were waiting for quantitative data, that we were gaining really good qualitative data, so that's what we spent most of fall quarter doing. And then the quantitative data came from the data office at San Jose Unified, so we just put in a request and waited patiently for the request.
Awesome, thanks.
Are all those things, you never put ends or statistical significance or anything? I assume they all are, is that right? How big are the samples, and are they significantly different from zero, these graphs that you put up?
Yeah, we have not put statistical significance on there. It's not all of them, especially because the population of alternative students is so small that something that we'll have in our final report, but the N is just really small in terms of comparing to traditional school students. I mean, we had, 60,000 observations, and probably 1,500 of those would be alternative school students. So that is important to note, that the N is small.
Can I, oh, sorry, go ahead.